He exploded onto the scene as the champion of the French Revolution, a voice for the voiceless, promising a new dawn of liberty and justice for all. They called him the Incorruptible, a man of unwavering principle in an age of staggering corruption. But what happens when a hero, drunk on absolute power, becomes the very monster he swore to destroy? What happens when the demand for virtue can only be satisfied by terror? This is the twisted tale of Maximilien Robespierre, the man who sent thousands to the guillotine in the name of freedom, and in the end, faced that same blade himself. To get a handle on the man, you first have to get a handle on his world. Late 18th century France was a kingdom teetering on the brink of collapse. For centuries, it had been ruled by the Ancien Regime, or Old Order, a system built on the divine right of kings and feudal privilege. Society was split into three rigid classes, or estates. At the top, you had the first estate, the clergy, and the second, the nobility. Together, they were a tiny sliver of the population, yet they held nearly all the wealth, paid almost no taxes, and pulled every lever of power. And below them was everyone else, the massive third estate, over 97% of France. The merchants, the lawyers, the artisans, and the millions of peasants who broke their backs in the fields. They carried the entire kingdom on their shoulders, crushed by back-breaking taxes that paid for the royals' lavish parties and a string of failed wars. While King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette lived in unimaginable luxury at Versailles, the people of Paris were starving. The price of bread, the food of the poor, was skyrocketing, and a quiet simmer of resentment was about to boil over into a full-blown roar. Into this powder keg fell the sparks of a radical new idea, the Enlightenment. Philosophers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau were pushing reason over tradition, liberty over tyranny, and the basic rights of man. They argued that a government's power shouldn't come from God, but from the consent of the people it governs. These ideas, once whispered in fancy salons, were now being shouted in the streets of Paris. The people were waking up to the idea that they didn't have to be subjects, they could be citizens. That a new world was possible, a world of liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, brotherhood. The stage was set for a revolution, a tidal wave that would not only shatter France, but send shockwaves across the globe. All it needed was a leader, someone with the vision, the will, and the absolute conviction to speak for the millions. Someone to channel all that rage and hope into a new reality. That man was Maximilien Robespierre. Before he was the revolution's great arbiter, Maximilien François-Marie Isidore de Robespierre was a quiet, bookish boy from the town of Arras. Born in 1758, his childhood was shaped by tragedy. His mother died when he was only 6, and his heartbroken father, a lawyer, abandoned the family soon after, leaving Maximilien and his 3 younger siblings with their grandparents. This early loss forced him to be serious, solitary, and intensely disciplined. He was a boy who had to become a man overnight, a trait that would define his entire life. But his mind was undeniable. He won a scholarship to the prestigious college Louis-le-Grand in Paris, the best school in France. It was here, surrounded by the sons of the elite, that the poor boy from Arras made his name through sheer hard work, mastering the classics and law. And it was here he became obsessed with his philosophical hero, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Robespierre was captivated by Rousseau's idea of the general will, the belief that a true republic must be governed by the collective will of its people, and that public life demanded immense personal virtue. For Robespierre, these weren't just academic ideas. They became his personal gospel, a moral code he would follow with a righteous and ultimately ruthless devotion. After getting his law degree in 1781, he went back to Arras to practice law. He didn't build a reputation for being flashy, but for being principled. He took the cases no one else would touch, defending the poor and the marginalized against the powerful. He spoke out against an unjust legal system and even resigned as a criminal judge because he couldn't bring himself to hand down a death sentence, a fact whose irony would later become terrifyingly stark. In these early years, you can see the blueprint of the man he'd become, a figure of immense self-control, driven by a rigid moral code and a deep empathy for the oppressed. He was known for his simple lifestyle and meticulous dress. He was, by all accounts, incorruptible. He believed in justice, in the goodness of the common person, and in the power of reason to build a better world. By 1789, he was known throughout his home province as a tireless champion for the people. It was that reputation that would soon carry him to the very center of the storm. By 1789, the French monarchy was broke. Desperate for cash, King Louis XVI did something no French king had done in 175 years. He called a meeting of the Estates General, the Grand Assembly of all three classes. For Robespierre, this was his chance. He ran for election and, thanks to his reputation, was chosen to represent the Third Estate. When he arrived at Versailles, the 30-year-old lawyer from the provinces was a nobody. With a weak voice and a stiff, formal demeanor, his first speeches in the National Assembly, the new body formed by the defiant Third Estate, were mostly ignored. But he was relentless. Day after day, he took to the podium, speaking with a fiery conviction that slowly started to get him noticed. In total, he would speak over 500 times. His demands were radical, even for the time. He called for an end to privilege, voting rights for all men, the right to bear arms for self-defense, and the complete abolition of slavery in the French colonies. He argued that every single law had to align with the new Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. While others were ready to compromise with the monarchy, Robespierre wasn't. For him, the principles of the revolution were absolute. This uncompromising stance made him a hero in the radical Jacobin Club, a political society in Paris that became the nerve center of the revolution. Here, his words found a captive audience. He quickly became the club's leading voice, his influence spreading like wildfire through a network of affiliated clubs across France. He argued that the revolution wasn't just about politics, it was a moral crusade. France, he believed, was fighting a war of liberty against tyranny, and in that war, you couldn't be neutral. This unbending conviction earned him his famous nickname, the Incorruptible. It was a title he relished. A contemporary once joked that Robespierre was the kind of man who would pay someone to offer him a bribe just so he could publicly refuse it. He didn't see himself as a politician, but as the pure vessel of the people's will. In his mind, those who followed him were patriots. Those who opposed him were enemies of the people. This black and white view of the world was his greatest strength, and ultimately, his most catastrophic weakness. As the revolution spun into chaos, marked by the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, Robespierre's clear, unwavering voice cut through the noise, offering a vision of a pure, virtuous republic, no matter the cost. The real turning point for the revolution, and for Robespierre, came in June 1791. King Louis XVI and his family, feeling like prisoners in Paris, tried to flee the country in disguise. They hoped to rally other European monarchs and return to crush the revolution. They were caught in the town of Varennes and dragged back to Paris in disgrace. For many, this betrayal destroyed any last hope of a constitutional monarchy. For Robespierre, it was all the proof he needed. The king and the revolution could not coexist. He immediately demanded a trial. The king's failed escape radicalized the public. Fearing that foreign powers would intervene, France declared war on Austria and Prussia in April 1792. The war started terribly for the French, and panic seized Paris. Robespierre and the Jacobins argued they were fighting on two fronts, against foreign armies at the border and against the enemy within, the king and his royalist supporters, whom they branded as traitors. On August 10, 1792, the situation exploded. A mob of radical Parisians stormed the Tuileries Palace, where the king was living. In the bloody battle that followed, the king's Swiss guards were massacred, and the royal family was forced to seek refuge with the very assembly they once commanded. This attack was the effective end of 1,000 years of French monarchy. A new, more radical government, the National Convention, was elected, with Robespierre as a leading deputy for Paris. Its first act? To declare France a republic. Now, the convention faced its biggest question: what to do with the former king, now known simply as Citizen Louis Capet? The more moderate faction, the Girondins, were hesitant. They worried that executing the king would plunge France into more chaos and unite all of Europe against them. Robespierre saw no room for debate. He delivered a series of powerful, chillingly logical speeches that sealed the king's fate. He argued this wasn't a normal trial. The king wasn't a citizen. He was a traitor, the living symbol of tyranny. To put him on trial was to put the revolution itself on trial. In a famous declaration to the convention, he stated, "Louis must die, so that the nation may live." To show mercy to the tyrant, he insisted, would be a crime against the millions he oppressed. His argument won. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. The execution sent a defiant message to the rest of Europe and cemented the Republic. But it also marked a point of no return. The revolution was now on a path paved with blood. For Robespierre, this was a necessary step to purify the nation. It was the moment he went from being a critic of the old world to an architect of the new, a republic founded on virtue, to be defended by any means necessary. The king's execution didn't bring peace. It plunged France deeper into crisis. Horrified, the monarchies of Europe, Britain, Spain, the Dutch Republic, all joined the war against the young French Republic. The nation was surrounded, facing invasion from all sides. But the threat wasn't just external. Inside France, the Republic was tearing itself apart. A brutal civil war erupted in the deeply Catholic and royalist region of the Vade, a counter-revolution that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. In major cities like Lyon and Marseille, other revolts broke out, led by political factions who opposed the growing radicalism in Paris. The economy was in a freefall, food was scarce, and the government's paper money was nearly worthless. The Republican dream was on the verge of collapsing into a nightmare of anarchy. It was in this climate of extreme crisis and paranoia that the National Convention made a fateful decision. In April 1793, it created the Committee of Public Safety, a 12-man council given extraordinary powers to defend the revolution from all its enemies, both inside and out. Robespierre wasn't on the committee at first, but as the crisis worsened, his influence grew. He argued that to save the nation, the government needed to be stronger, more centralized, and more ruthless. Inside the convention, a bitter power struggle was raging between Robespierre's radical faction, the Montagnards, named because they sat on the highest benches, and the more moderate Girondins. The Girondins now found themselves accused of being weak, of sympathizing with the traitors who were destroying France. Robespierre, using his support among the radical Parisian working class, the sans-culottes, attacked them relentlessly. On June 2, 1793, under the threat of armed sans-culottes organized by the Jacobins, the convention voted to arrest 29 Girondin deputies. It was a political purge. The moderate opposition was gone. The Jacobins were now in complete control. In July, Robespierre was finally elected to the Committee of Public Safety. He and his allies now held the reins of power. The Emergency Committee was about to become the instrument of a new, terrifying phase of the revolution, and Robespierre, the Incorruptible, would be its guide. He believed he had a mandate to do whatever it took to save the Republic. The only question was, what would be the price? With the Jacobins in power and Robespierre as the moral voice of the Committee of Public Safety, the government declared that terror is the order of the day. What came next was one of the bloodiest and most controversial chapters in modern history, the Reign of Terror. To Robespierre, this wasn't mindless slaughter. It was a logical, necessary policy. In a famous speech, he laid out his chilling philosophy. If the basis of popular government in time of peace is virtue, he argued, the basis of popular government in time of revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue, without which terror is murderous. Terror, without which virtue is powerless. In his mind, the state had a duty to use fear as a weapon to purify the nation and eliminate anyone standing in the way of a virtuous republic. To make this happen, the committee built a terrifyingly efficient machine of repression. The Law of Suspects, passed in September 1793, cast a chillingly wide net. It allowed for the arrest of anyone who, by their conduct, associations, or writings, showed themselves to be partisans of tyranny and enemies of liberty. The definition was so vague that anyone could be accused. A disgruntled neighbor or a business rival could send a person to prison with a single denunciation. At the heart of this machine was the Revolutionary Tribunal. Here, normal rules of justice didn't apply. Trials were fast, and the accused had few rights. The goal wasn't to find out if someone was guilty, but to publicly condemn and eliminate enemies. Across France, representatives on mission wielded dictatorial power, overseeing mass arrests and executions. In Paris, the guillotine, the national razor, became a permanent fixture, its blade falling day after day. The mood in Paris became one of suffocating fear. No one was safe. A movement that began to secure liberty had morphed into a police state, where a careless word could get you killed. People stopped using monsieur and madame, opting for the revolutionary citizen to avoid looking aristocratic. They wore revolutionary cockades and red Liberty bonnets to prove their loyalty. Every action was scrutinized, every motive questioned. The revolution, in its hunt for absolute purity, had turned on itself. And Robespierre, the man who once resigned as a judge to avoid passing a death sentence, now presided over a system that would officially execute around 17,000 people, with tens of thousands more dying in prisons or without a trial. It's a chilling thought, how a fight for liberty can descend into such tyranny. Robespierre's story is a powerful reminder of how noble ideals can be twisted into something monstrous. If you're finding this deep dive into one of history's most complex figures compelling, please take a moment to support the channel by hitting that like button. It truly helps us bring more of these incredible and important histories to light. Now, let's get back to the height of the terror, as Robespierre's revolution begins to devour its own. By the spring of 1794, the reign of terror had crushed the immediate threats to the Republic. French armies were winning on the battlefield, and internal rebellions were being brutally stamped out. But the terror didn't stop. It got worse. Robespierre now turned the weapon of the state against his own revolutionary allies. The revolution, as the saying goes, was beginning to devour its own children. First to go were the radicals to his left, the Hébertists. Led by the journalist Jacques Hébert, these ultra-revolutionaries were atheists who promoted a cult of reason, trashing churches and staging mock religious ceremonies. Robespierre, who believed in a supreme being, saw their atheism as moral anarchy and, more importantly, a threat to his power. In March 1794, Hébert and his followers were arrested, put through a show trial, and quickly sent to the guillotine. Next, Robespierre turned on the indulgents to his right. This group was led by one of the giants of the revolution, Georges Danton. Danton was everything Robespierre wasn't: loud, pragmatic, and known for his love of life's pleasures. He had been a key leader in toppling the monarchy. Now, he and his friend, the journalist Camille Desmoulins, argued that with the war going better, it was time to scale back the terror and show some mercy. To Robespierre, this was treason. Easing up on the terror before the Republic of Virtue was fully built would be a fatal weakness. He saw Danton's pragmatism as corruption. Despite their past alliance, Robespierre made his move. He accused Danton and his allies of conspiracy and corruption. In late March 1794, Danton, Desmoulins, and their supporters were arrested. Their trial was a joke. When Danton's powerful speeches started winning over the jury, the convention, urged on by Robespierre, passed a new rule preventing the accused from speaking in their own defense. On April 5, 1974, they were led to the scaffold. Danton was defiant to the last. As he passed Robespierre's house, he reportedly shouted, "You will follow me." His famous last words to the executioner were, "Show my head to the people." It is well worth seeing. With both the radicals and the moderates gone, Robespierre stood alone at the absolute peak of his power. He had silenced all dissent. He was the master of the Jacobins, the Committee of Public Safety, and the revolution itself. But in his ruthless quest for a pure republic, he had killed his rivals, his critics, and even his friends. He was now surrounded by men who feared him. His isolation was complete. The Incorruptible was now a tyrant. At the height of his power in the spring of 1794, Robespierre did something that showed just how grand his vision, and perhaps his ego, had become. He didn't just want to remake France's politics. He wanted to remake its soul. Disgusted by atheism, he convinced the National Convention to establish a new state religion, the cult of the Supreme Being. This was a deist faith, based on a belief in a creator god and the immortality of the soul, ideas Robespierre thought were essential for civic virtue. To kick it all off, he planned a massive public festival on June 8, 1794, and he, as president of the convention, would act as its high priest. The festival was a bizarre spectacle. A huge, fake mountain was built on the Champ de Mars. Robespierre, wearing a sky blue coat and carrying flowers and wheat, led a procession. He gave speeches about virtue and set fire to a statue of atheism, from which a statue of wisdom was meant to appear. But for many watching, this wasn't inspiring. It was a deeply unsettling display of one man's ego. Deputies muttered that Robespierre wasn't just acting like a master, but like a god. The event, meant to cement his moral authority, instead crystallized the growing fear that he was becoming a dictator. Just 2 days later, Robespierre pushed through his most terrifying law yet, the Law of 22 Prairial. This law put the terror into overdrive. It stripped the accused of almost all rights. They couldn't have defense lawyers, and no witnesses were allowed. The court could only deliver 2 verdicts: acquittal or death. It also expanded the definition of an enemy of the people to include anyone who tried to deprave morals or weaken the government. This unleashed what's known as the Great Terror. In the 6 weeks that followed, the pace of the guillotine became horrific. Over 1,300 people were executed in Paris during this period, more than in the entire previous year. An atmosphere of absolute dread fell over the city, especially on the deputies of the convention. The law had also removed their immunity from arrest. Now, no one was safe from Robespierre. They watched their colleagues disappear, wondering each day if they'd be next. The man of virtue had created a system of arbitrary death, and they realized they had to destroy him before he destroyed them all. By July 1794, the political temperature in Paris was at a boiling point. A huge victory by the French army at the Battle of Fleurus had ended the threat of foreign invasion. The main reason for the terror, defending a nation in danger, was gone. Yet, the executions continued. A conspiracy against Robespierre was quietly forming. It was a strange alliance of hardline terrorists who feared Robespierre would purge them for their own brutality, and former allies of Danton seeking revenge. Powerful men like Joseph Fouché and Jean-Lambert Tallien, who knew Robespierre saw them as enemies, joined in, fighting for their own survival. Robespierre seemed to sense the danger. He vanished from public life for several weeks, staying away from both the convention and the committee, maybe out of paranoia or exhaustion. On July 26, 1794, or 8 Thermidor on the revolutionary calendar, he returned to the convention to give his final speech. It was a long, rambling, 2-hour threat. He defended his own virtue and spoke of a massive conspiracy against liberty, insisting another purge was necessary. He mentioned traitors in the heart of the government, even on the Committee of Public Safety itself. But then, he made a fatal mistake. He refused to name them. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. By leaving the threat vague, he made every man in the room feel like a target. His unnamed accusation united his enemies and terrified everyone else. The fear of being on his list was now greater than the fear of opposing him. The next day, 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794, the conspirators made their move. When Robespierre's ally, Saint-Just, rose to speak, he was shouted down by Tallien, who dramatically brandished a dagger and denounced Robespierre as a tyrant. A planned chorus of shouts erupted. "Down with the tyrant! Arrest him!" Robespierre tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the hostile roar. For the first time, he was powerless. The man whose voice had guided the revolution was now being silenced by it. The convention, finding its courage, quickly voted to arrest Robespierre, his brother Augustin, and his closest allies. They were declared outlaws. The tyrant had fallen. The final hours of Maximilien Robespierre were pure chaos. After his arrest, he and his allies were taken to the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall, where the loyal Paris Commune tried to raise an armed force to save him. For a few tense hours, it looked like civil war might break out, but the call to arms was mostly ignored. The people of Paris, alienated by the endless executions and exhausted by the terror, didn't mobilize for him. In the early morning of July 28th, troops loyal to the convention stormed the building. What happened next is still a mystery. Robespierre was found with his jaw shattered by a gunshot. We'll never know if it was a botched suicide attempt or a shot from one of the guards. Lying on a table, bleeding and unable to speak, the man who held the power of life and death over a nation was now a broken, silent prisoner. There was no trial. In a final, fitting irony, Robespierre and his followers were condemned by the very laws they had created. As outlaws, they could be executed after a simple verification of their identity. On the afternoon of July 28, 1794, 10 Thermidor, Robespierre, his brother, and 19 of their followers were carted to the Place de la Révolution. His face was bandaged, his sky-blue festival coat now stained with blood. The crowds that once cheered his name now screamed curses, celebrating the end of the terror. He was the last to be executed. As he was laid on the guillotine's plank, the executioner ripped off his bandage, causing him to let out a final, agonized scream that was silenced only by the falling blade. The head of the Incorruptible dropped into the basket, and a massive cheer erupted from the crowd, a cheer that reportedly lasted for 15 minutes. The reign of terror was over. So, what do we make of Maximilien Robespierre? His story is one of history's most compelling and terrifying tragedies. He started as a genuine champion for the oppressed, a man of principle who fought for liberty, equality, and justice. Yet, in his fanatical quest to build a republic of virtue, he came to believe that any means were justified to achieve his perfect world. He fused his own will with the will of the people and saw any disagreement as treason. The line between hero and monster, between savior and tyrant, blurred until it vanished completely. His legacy is still fiercely debated. Was he a bloodthirsty dictator who hijacked a revolution? Or a tragic idealist, corrupted by power and pushed to extremes by war and crisis? Was the terror a necessary evil that saved France, or a monstrous crime that stained the very idea of revolution? The truth is, he was probably all of these things at once. His story stands as a timeless and chilling warning about the dangers of ideological purity and the terrifying speed at which a fight for freedom can become its exact opposite. What's your take? Was Robespierre a villain, a misunderstood hero, or something far more complicated? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of history's most dramatic falls from grace. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the past.